got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride, but she don't care.
And welcome to episode number 6 of Ticket to Ride, my review of my games from the Ryde-Eastwood Open. This is my round 6 game against Emma Guo from the ACT. Her ACF rating is 2027 and her FIDE rating is 1998, so fairly evenly matched, at least on paper, and I'm black in this game. It starts off with, again, employing another modern defence, as I have a habit of doing. And after knight f3, I decided to play for an immediate d5. As happens in the game, we ended up in a line that you might get ordinarily from a centre counter or Scandinavian defence. But the other main option for white here is to play e5, and I'm more than happy to go into those sorts of positions where the main idea, similar to what I've discussed in some other videos, if for example white plays e5, I basically want to get this bishop out on g4 and exchange the bishop for the knight, put my pawns in the center on white squares, and again you've got the pawn on g6 already on white square, and play for a break in the center with c5. You have knights that can maneuver around, and the target is this d4 pawn, so you'd have after obviously c5 and e6, the knights can maneuver around a c6, the queen might come to b6. This knight is headed for the f5 square, either via h6 or via e7. And again, they're all about putting pressure on this d4 pawn in a blocked position. However, Emma decided to take on d5, which is again a perfectly reasonable move in this position. I played queen takes d5, and she played a quiet line here, just bishop e2. Here I probably played, I guess in hindsight, maybe a little bit too passively, although I don't think c6 itself is a bad move. She followed up with c4, and I put the queen back on d6. I thought this is probably a more useful square. It helps control f4 and obviously prevents, at least temporarily, white's bishop from going there. And it's a bit more flexible. I might have sort of options at some stage of sort of threatening queen b4 ideas, depending on what white does. And there's also the sort of pressure continued to be put on the d4 pawn. This is something where I think I probably went astray a little bit further down the track, which we'll get to shortly. Emma then followed up with knight c3, and I played bishop g4, which to my mind at least is fairly thematic, because I want to basically get that bishop outside the pawn chain before basically putting pretty much all my pawns on white squares. The idea that I'll have the pawns covering the white squares. Obviously I've got sort of b7, c6, f7, g6, and eventually this pawn's going to go to e6 and join that sort of white square pawn chain, and I'll have the bishop guarding the dark squares, obviously in conjunction with the queen in this case. So to my mind it's a fairly sort of harmonious plan as far as piece placement is concerned. Emma played bishop e3, which is again a fairly logical developing move, again overprotecting d4, because obviously the threat was to capture on f3 and then take on d4. And here's where I think I played a bit of an inaccurate move. knight f6 seems like, I guess, a natural sort of move. But in this position, I think a better option is actually knight h6. The point being that from h6, the knight can then head to the key f5 square, and again from there it's threatening both the pawn on d4 and one of the defenders of the pawn on the bishop on e3. And again, this whole idea of trying to pile up pressure on this d4 pawn, something that I really didn't do enough of during the game. And I really think this inaccuracy allowed Emma to basically set up the position that she wanted, and I really didn't get the counterplay that I need as black in these types of positions. So knight f6, inaccurate move, and really one I regretted later on. Emma played a fairly good move here, particularly given that, at least temporarily, I've blocked the diagonal that the bishop's on. She took the opportunity to play knight e5. Very good move, centralising the knight. Obviously it's threatening the bishop on g4, so I'm pretty much forced to swap that. And it also gets the queen off the d file. This allows the rook, most likely the rook from a1 to come to d1 to help protect the d pawn, and makes my attack, given that one of the attackers is the queen, that little bit weaker. I followed up with sort of logical development, knight d7, and Emma played f4 to support the knight. So obviously if I play knight takes knight on e5, she's simply going to recapture with the f pawn and fork my queen and knight, which obviously isn't a good thing for me. So that really stops any ideas, at least for the moment, that I might have of exchanging pieces in the centre. And given that Emma has this space advantage, given that she's got sort of the three pawns in the centre, she's got the sort of the pawn on c4, d4, f4, and by comparison, my pawns have only got to the third rank. That space advantage and the fact that I can't actually do much about the centre at the moment means that white has a definite advantage in this position. Here I castled, and Emma castled in response as well, and I played rook f2 d8. At the time I was a little unsure about which rook wanted to go there, and whether my rook actually wanted to leave f8 at all. Given that Emma's already put the pawn on f4, I could see the potential at some stage later in the game of maybe using that f pawn as a way to break open a line on my king, maybe playing f5 and possibly taking on g6 or something like that. So potentially the rook could be useful on f8, but I think the most obvious place for me to attack is down the d file, and sort of target obviously this d pawn. However, the question then comes as to which rook. Do I want the rook from f8 or do I want the rook from a8? And this is a dilemma that you'll often find yourself in games of chess, where either rook is seemingly has positives for making that move. In this case, given that there's a knight on e5, I thought if I was going to play any sort of pawn break to again try and attack this d pawn, it was going to be moving the c pawn up to c5 potentially. In which case, the squares where I want my rooks would be c8 and d8. So obviously the a rook goes to c8, the f rook goes to d8. That was the idea at the time. Whether that's actually the best idea in the position is a whole other issue, but that was my my thinking at the time, the logic behind playing that rook f d8 move. By the same token, Emma's response, rook a d8, is also fairly logical. She wants to keep her f rook behind that f4 pawn and keep the option of playing f5 up her sleeve. She wants to keep it there as long as possible. And she's really not going to be playing. Her advantages aren't going to come on the queen side. They're going to come in the centre or on the king side. Obviously, if she wanted to and didn't mind sort of opening up things a little bit, there's sort of ideas already of playing things like G4 and G5 on the king side. Again, this F5 break, and maybe even something in the centre with either the C or D pawns. However, as far as Emma's concerned, nothing is really going to happen for her on the queen side. If anything's going to happen, it's going to be my counter-attack happening with, again, as I was saying, either C5, maybe B5, or something along those lines, is my sort of attempts to get potential counterplay while she's getting some play in the centre and on the king side. I played A6, which is a bit of a dual-purpose move. One of the problems that I thought with playing C5 immediately was the B5 square and knight B5, which would potentially be a bit of a problem if the pawn was still back on A7. So I thought, to avoid that issue, as well as helping support a potential B5 advance, A6 seemed like a logical move at the time. The problem is that, again, it doesn't really help in terms of development. The attack still, or counter-attack, hasn't really got going, and even if it does, it still doesn't really seem to achieve all that much. I need to do something with the queen, as at the moment when it's lined up on the D file, I obviously can't play the C5 break, as Emma can simply play D takes C5, and I'm going to have to retreat the queen again because of the attack from the rook. So obviously I still can't play the move that I want. It's another preparatory move, and even if I do get B5 or C5 in, it still doesn't actually achieve that much, just because the centre's so solid for white here. There's not a lot of holes in the position, and yeah, there's really sort of very few obvious breaks for me in this position. Emma played an interesting move here. She played bishop F2. I suppose she's like what actually ended up happening up later. She ended up utilising this bishop on a different diagonal. She ended up bringing the bishop out to H4 and having an attack that sort of H4 to D8 diagonal, which proved to be useful. And maybe one of my later moves is could be a little bit inaccurate, I suppose, in that sense. I followed up with B5, which to my mind seems like a logical move in this sort of position. Emma played rook E1, and given that she now has the queen and king lined up on the E file, I was a little concerned about potential problems with my E pawn. I thought maybe just say a simple move like moving the knight back to maybe D3 or F3 or something like that, and then all of a sudden I've got problems with queen takes E7 coming. So with that in mind, and again continuing with that earlier idea that I've swapped off my white squared bishop, thought I'd play E6. Again, seemed like a good idea at the time, but as I mentioned a couple of moves ago, this creates problems along this H4 to D8 diagonal, and in particular this problems with the F6 knight, which we'll see a bit later on. Emma played just a logical reinforcing move, B3, just protecting that C pawn again, so that if I do take on C4, she's not forced to move her queen or knight away from the positions that they're in at the moment. I played rook A to C8. Again, I still had these sort of vague ideas of playing C5 at some stage, but as far as this sort of ideas of getting some play on the queen side, at least there's sort of starting to look like hints of some sort of attack happening. If I get a chance to, I can play maybe a move like queen b8 and then follow it up with c5, and I do sort of have at least some sort of attacking threats on the d4 square in particular. WIM Emma followed this up with bishop h4, which is a very good move, obviously pinning the f6 knight to the rook on d8. And this creates a problem because I really would like to leave the rook on d8, but I'm obviously not a fan of the pin either. Particularly given that there's sort of multiple ways to pile up pressure on this knight. Obviously you've got the knight from c3 that can jump into e4. You might have ideas of sort of knight on e5 taking on d7. And again, I really didn't like the potential problems that could happen with this f6 knight. So I thought to get out of the pin immediately would be my best option, and I played rook e8. Again, in hindsight, probably not a move I'm really overjoyed about, but it's not easy to find a very good alternative here. Emma played queen f3, which is another strong move, keeping pressure on the c6 pawn in this case. So that earlier idea that I mentioned about maybe playing queen b8 and pushing the c5 isn't possible because I now drop the c6 pawn. Obviously I still can't take on e5 yet because of that pawn fork. So again, I have to modify my plan slightly. So instead of going back to b8, I went to c7 with the queen. Still looking for this c5 idea. However, again, there's more problems with it. If I ever play c5, now the pawn I have to worry about is the b5 pawn, obviously because it's attacked by both the pawn on c4 and the knight on c3. And at the moment, it's only defended by, obviously at the moment it's defended by the pawn on a6 and c6. But if I move that c6 pawn, there's two attackers, one defender, and it's not the type of position where I want to give up material unless I really get something for it. King h1, another logical move, getting out of the way of any sort of potential danger that might sort of happen along this diagonal. Maybe there might be a queen b6 or a queen a7 or some kind of move like that at some stage that could be annoying. So Emma just sidesteps that altogether. And here I'm not really sure about my next move. I just feel like I need to do something active in the position. I don't know. I don't really have any active alternatives. If I ever sort of decide to take on e5 with a move like knight takes e5, the simple recapture, and now I have sort of real problems about worrying about the f-file being sort of open. You've got obviously the bishop that's can potentially come in f6 and get rid of this dark squared bishop, and it's really a lot of problems that I'd rather not have to worry about. So if I can't play that move, what other moves do I play? I don't really have many other alternatives. The knight on f6 really doesn't have many squares available to it. The rooks again are still pretty much tied down to the squares that they're on. So I looked for an alternative and thought, well, maybe I can do something, given that I'm looking for an attack on the black squares on the king side. Maybe I can utilise the bishop on g7 over on the queen side. So I thought maybe a move like bishop f8 with, again, potentially ideas of either supporting this c5 advance or possibly even coming out to b4 and trying to create sort of issues with at least tying down some of the queenside pieces of white. Here Emma took on d7, and with the bishop now not defending the knight on f6, I have to recapture with the knight. And this allows white's knight to come into e4. So again, the problem with this move is that I lose control of this critical f6 square. And now this bishop really needs to stay on the king side, as these sort of dark squares around the king are starting to look a little bit weak, and potentially this d6 square could also be a problem from here. You've got the knight that can really sort of is in a fantastic position on e4. I can jump to all these fantastic squares that I don't have control over at the moment. Here again, something to try and fight for control of f6. Again, whether it's the best move or not is debatable, but it seemed logical at the time. But in hindsight, again, probably not the best move. I played king g7. Again, the idea is to cover the f6 square. I was looking at maybe ideas of possibly playing maybe f6 or even f5 to try and get rid of this knight from f6, or at least help control a lot of these squares. In this position, Fritz actually prefers taking on c4, with the idea of, after white recaptures, playing rook b8 and looking to get maybe some kind of play down the b file with, say, a rook coming into b2 or b4. However, here again, another very good move by Emma after king g7. She simply switched her pieces around, played a very good move, bishop g3. Obviously now with the bishop and queen lined up, f5 becomes a serious threat. I don't want to play f5 just yet, as I really don't have a way, if I do play a move like f5 after black's knight goes to g5, I really don't have an easy way to defend the e6 pawn, obviously with it being attacked by the knight and the rook on e1. I really don't have an easy way to defend it, so f5 for me isn't an option, and that means it's really a very serious threat as a move that white can play. So I played queen d8, which again has its good point that it is off this sort of diagonal that the bishop's on. However, I've now moved it back into the line of the rook on d1. So although I've sort of temporarily solved one problem, I've created another, and it doesn't really help in terms of solving these problems. Emma played a quiet move here, h3. I guess it might be just a precautionary move just in case something happens on the back rank. It's also a useful move in terms of a potential kingside attack. She might at some stage want to maybe move the bishop back to h2 and allow for a move like g4 or something along those lines. However, none of that's actually needed based on what happens in the game. And here I play another inaccurate move. I was again worried about where this knight on e4 could go, and I thought I wanted to play the f5 move, but I didn't want to have to worry about the problems of the e6 pawn after knight g5. So my logic was, I'll play h6. The idea being that I can control this key g5 square, and then I can prepare f5 and kick this troublesome knight on e4 away from its fantastic position, and then maybe bring my knight back to f6 and sort of slowly reorganize my pieces and hopefully sort of regroup and be able to defend this position. However, Emma plays an excellent move now. She plays d5. Fantastic break in the center. I really don't have a lot of choice here. Obviously, if I allow taking on e6, I really don't think it's very good for me. It also opens up the d6 square for the knight and the rook. And the other issue that I have is now this long diagonal on the dark squares is open and it's pointing at my king. So there's ideas of swinging the queen across to a square like c3, and all of a sudden my king could be in a bit of danger. I decided to take with the e-pawn, again, which may or may not be the best, but my idea was to try and get some sort of play on the queen side afterwards. If I take with the c-pawn, for example, I think I'm committed then to exchanging again on d5 and allowing, obviously, the end of the recaptures rook d5, and this just leaves me with a really awkward position where all my pieces are tied down. The knight on d7, if I exchange twice here, so c takes, c takes, c takes, rook takes, the big problem for me in this position is now what happens with my knight. Again, because of this, the pin on the queen, and have real trouble sort of untangling myself. The queen needs to stay somewhere to defend the knight. Obviously, if I go to c7, then there's the problem of the diagonal with the bishop on g3. If I go to e7 with the queen, again I've got the rook on e1 now on an open file. So there's more problems there, and if I can't sort out that problem, apart from having a big bunch of colours in the centre of the screen, I really think my position is deteriorating. So my idea here is to take with the e-pawn, she recaptured, and then to play c5. And hopefully, the idea being if I can keep the d-file blocked, maybe I can sort of play around the passed d-pawn and get away with things that way. However, easy said than done. Fritz actually, rather than c5, it actually prefers bishop b4, with the idea of, obviously I'm attacking the rook on e1, so after a move like say rook e3, then playing f5. Again, this grand idea that I've had for the last sort of 5 or 6 moves, if not longer, to dislodge a knight on e4. This might give me a bit more of a fighting chance. Obviously white's still better in this position, but at least black's doing something a little bit more active than what happened in the game. So after c5, white beat me to it and played f5, which is an excellent move in this position. My big problem is that once f6, if white ever plays f6, I've always got to be worried about what's going to happen to my king. So to try and cover the f6 square, I played bishop e7, but it turns out to be just a really bad mistake, because now when the pawn gets f6, it's with check and it's threatening the bishop on e7. So it creates more problems. The trouble is, in this position, I really don't have a good response, and I think I'm pretty much busted in this position. So bishop e7, not very good, but there's not really much alternative here. Emma played rook f1, again trying to pile up on that f6 square, and again there's also threats of not only pushing the pawn to f6, but you've also got the threats of just simply taking on g6 and then the queen coming into f7, and that's obviously not going to be very good for me either. So to try and cover this invasion on the f file, I played rook f8, but that just loses in not so pretty fashion. The alternative here that I might have been able to try was g5, but even that runs into f6. And after bishop takes, there's knight d6. Pick up and exchange, if not more, and there's still all this pressure on the f file that I have to be concerned about. So rook f8, bad move, and f6 check is the reason why. Bishop takes, knight takes. I could see that bishop e5 was going to be the problem at the end of this line. So I'd initially sort of thought that if I did this, she'd simply swap knight takes and then bishop e5, and I'm dropping a piece. She still has to pass the d-pawn, and the game's effectively over. However, this obviously it's lost still, but it's probably not quite as convincingly lost as after what I actually played in the game. So after knight takes f6, I thought, oh well, maybe I can try my big counter-attack on the queen side with c4, the move again after c5 that I've been wanting to play for the last 10 or 15 moves. Trouble is, simply knight takes d7, queen takes, queen f6 check, king has to go to h7, and then bishop e5, and I really am busted. And this is where I resign. The only way to actually defend the mate is to play rook g8, then simply queen takes pawn on f7. I then have to swap queens. The rook comes into f7, and the only way to actually get out of check is to give up the rook for free. So after bishop e5, game's over and I resign, which is something I was a bit disappointed about. Really comes back to what happened right out of the opening. I played that slight inaccuracy with knight f6, with the knight h6 coming to f5 would have been a better idea. And once I let Emma get that knight in on e5, supported by the pawn on f4, just that space advantage and the ability to just squeeze the position and keep my pieces sort of tied up and in really awkward positions was what she used fantastically to her advantage to go on and win the game. So once again, thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out the blog melbournegamescoach.blogspot.com, and I hope to see you for the next episode.